When I was a king and a mason, a master proven and skilled, I cleared me grounds for a palace, such as a king should build. I decreed and dug down to my levels, presently under the silt. I came on the wreck of a palace, such as a king had built. There was no worth in the fashion, there was no wit in the plan. Hither and thither aimless, the ruined footings ran. Masonry brute mishandled, but carven on every stone. After me cometh a builder, tell him I too have known. Swift to my use in my trenches, where my well-planned groundworks grew, I tumbled his quoits and his ashlars, and cut and reset them anew. Lime I milled of his marbles, burned it, slacked it, and spread, taking and leaving at pleasure the gifts of the humble dead. Yet I despised not nor gloried, yet we wrenched them apart. I read in the raised foundations the heart of that builder's heart. As he had written and pleaded, so did I understand the form of the dream he had followed in the face of the thing he had planned. When I was a king and a mason, in the open noon of my pride, they sent me a word from the darkness, they whispered and called me aside. They said the end is forbidden, they said thy use is fulfilled. The palace shall stand as the others, the spoils of a king who shall build. I called my men from my trenches, my quarries, my wharves and my shears. All I had wrought I abandoned to the faith of the faithless years. Only I cut on the timber, only I carved on the stone. After me cometh a builder, tell him I too have known. Good health to you, brothers and sisters, and welcome back to the Fire and Hammer podcast. My name is Gofi Cornwall, and this episode, our fifth episode, is titled Pagan Tomorrows. One of the topics that I've been thinking about somewhat recently has been about the future of our faith and the future of a pagan civilization. I thought to myself about bringing a guest on who had some knowledge on this. So I would like to introduce a real-world advocate, an engineer, a businessman, Oathsmith. Welcome, Oathsmith.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be on the podcast.
So, Oathsmith, tell me a bit about yourself in terms of your background on this topic, just because pagan civilization is one of those topics that I'm sure a lot of people listening haven't really thought of in terms of what the next steps are for our faith. So what's your background, firstly, with this?
It's quite a grandiose topic, isn't it, to consider pagan civilization as something that we think that we're moving towards generally. My background in this, as you've said before, is, I come from an engineering business background. I've worked in a few different industries and I've traveled to many places around the world. And what I would consider my expertise in this is bringing in a knowledge of previous civilizations historically. I'm very interested in history, as many people in this sphere are. I'm also quite interested in philosophical ideas. What I think that I can offer is integrating historical knowledge and knowledge of science and technology and where industry and business is going with knowledge of ancient civilizations in the past, how they've risen, how they've fallen, and how emerging cultures tend to develop and the conditions that bring them about. How Western civilization is currently developing. It's very clear that Western civilization, or in the very least, the nation-state governments that run Western economies and Western nations are starting to break down and deteriorate. And there are many signs that the governing political systems of these countries are at the end of their rope, in much the same way that we've seen countries like the old German Empire and the Weimar Republic diminish, the way that we've seen, the Roman Empire gets brought up a lot. But even the same way that Anglo-Saxon England fell, which you could say was a civilizational breakdown after the invasion of the Normans, the breakdown of the Byzantine Empire, of the Ottoman Empire. We see all of these conditions in these various civilizations come about just before a political collapse scenario, and we're getting near that point now. So it would be good for us as pagans to discuss how we can use this opportunity to our benefit in building a new civilization that has our beliefs at its forefront and our religious structure at the heart of it.
Quite so. And this leads me on to one of our starting questions, which is something that I've often considered. I call this the pagan hokey cokey, in, out, in, out. It's basically a question of whether or not pagans are an integral part of British society, or more so, whether or not we should consider British society to be something that we're continuing, or whether or not it's something that we kind of leave behind and move past. Now, I should clarify what I mean by this does not mean the abandoning of the identity of being British, but more so of whether or not we count as a continuation of that should such an event happen. So what's your thoughts on that?
So, my thoughts would be that, as you've rightly said, we all identify as British, English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, and those are our distinct ethnic groups. You don't come away from your bloodline. So, the idea that we would immediately, in a relatively quick succession, historically speaking, be able to stop being English or Scottish slash British and start adopting a completely new civilizational identity out of nowhere is somewhat ridiculous. Obviously, we are going to continue being British, but what changes is how you define Britishness as a civilizational concept. At one point, Britishness would have referred to a Celtic civilization that existed in the Isle of Britain. And post Britishness became synonymous with being a Briton, a Romanic Briton. And then after that, the Anglo Saxons adopted the idea of Britishness as Bretwalda. In none of these situations, fundamentally, did the ethnic people groups that made up Britain, with the exception of the Anglo Saxon invasions. And of course, that was a new ethnogenesis. Even under the Roman Empire, the people who lived in Britain very much were still the Romanic Britons. This is confirmed by genetic evidence that we have. The Romans did not change the genetic makeup of Britain very significantly. It's the bloodline continues, but the civilizational conditions change. And that's how we have to think about ourselves as a future pagan civilization going forward.
Absolutely. In terms of going forward into the future, obviously away from the historical context, which is still very important, you believe we would still constitute, even in a future open society, a continuation of this British identity on a national or even subnational level?
Absolutely. When we look at the nation state as it is and the economic cultural structure of Britain, there's not really a way that you can just detach yourself from it and be entirely separate, because all of the architecture, all of the mechanisms, all of the infrastructure that you would need to be able to have a separate civilizational system would be inherited from the main civilizational system which you exist next to anyway. You have to exist within that civilizational framework, especially because in Britain there's no amount of land or resources that you can just go and take. Everything in England, in Britain, is owned by somebody. All land is owned, all infrastructure, all resources are owned by somebody. You have to trade with someone, you have to buy from someone in order to get access to what you want, which inherently means being integrated in some way with the civilization that you exist within. What you do is you trade and you work within the civilization, but culturally, you work to a different structure. This is essentially the way that certain ethnic groups in Britain operate today. When you look at religious groups like Muslims and Hindus and Jews, when you look at the different ethnic, even within Britain, the different ethnic groups, Scotland has a different culture to England. It's not very, very different, but it is somewhat different. And the same with Wales, to the point where these countries have their own languages that are only really spoken in Scotland and Wales. They have their own media. You know, you have BBC Scotland and you have BBC Wales and Welsh media. These are not apart from British society, but they do run parallel. And in a situation where the United Kingdom broke down, for instance, if Scotland voted for independence, it has pre-existing infrastructure that it can use towards building its own identity. The way I feel is that pagans should do a similar thing. We should build our own cultural artifacts, our own media, our own businesses, our own way of looking at the world, the industries that we go into and the values that we live by. They can run parallel with British society and they can integrate and interact with British society, but it puts us as a distinct model within that. And as time goes on, and as the top down pressure of British civilization and its corroded values starts to wane, our values and our civilization can more and more approach into the old infrastructures, and we can take over more and more sections of society in a more cultural and economic way, not in a
Mm,
military way.
mm. I feel like a lot of pagans are kind of shifting towards that model more than the idea of quote unquote running away into the woods and just building a cabin. It's one of those big issues where, as much as there are a lot of issues in modern British society today, if we were just to leave those issues behind and try to move elsewhere as a way to avoid them, really all we're doing is inevitably leaving that issue to be dealt with by our children or their children's generations, which in my mind is cowardice. So I'll tangent onto a second point off of the back of that, because it does make a big difference in terms of either a post-collapse situation or even a normal situation if society carries on as it does. In terms of the folk as an entity across the country, there's a lot of different definitions that are thrown around in terms of who the folk are, whether they're of different beliefs, whether the folk are our faith folk. What's your views insofar as determining community, and what value would it hold to us?
So the folk to me really is something that we're still establishing as pagans. Of course, I would draw the lines that the Germanic folk is the Germanic folk. So, for instance, people that worship a Celtic pantheon or a Greco-Roman pantheon, Slavic pantheon, Baltic pantheons, etc. Yes, they're still pagans, but they are not of the folk that we are of. I would say that, strictly speaking, as Germanic pagans, we are a Germanic folk. And that can extend to variations in the pantheon. Like I would see, I would see myself as an Odinist slash an Anglo-Saxon pagan. I would see myself as the same folk as a strictly like Germanic Saxon pagan
Mm,
or like a Frisian pagan, because
mm.
ultimately we still worship the same pantheon of gods, even though we localize our systems of worship, perhaps. We do also need to separate ourselves from universalists. Culturally, that's an important distinction. But the main factor is blood. And if someone who's from North America, who's a worshipping Odinist, is of Northwest European heritage, then that for me is somebody that's of my folk as well.
Quite so. And in reality, there's no real correct answer for that, because as you've said quite correctly, there is no set definition in terms of who the folk are. There's quite often a question that I've read asked whether or not one would want their daughter to marry an African pagan or a English Christian, which typically people have quite a correct answer for, or rather there's a reverse of that, an English pagan or an African Christian. In this case, I suppose the question that would determine the folk going forward in what its identity is whether one would rather their daughter marry a Greek pagan or an English Christian. From my view, the folk as a whole really is a separation of an uppercase F to a lowercase f. The lowercase folk to me, or rather the small folk, really comes down to the wider tribal community that you're part of. As an uppercase folk, it makes sense to me that as our faith is in its origins in the Volkish movement, the folk uppercase refers to our pagan community as a whole.
Yes, I would agree. I'd say that's a fair comment. Addressing uppercase versus lowercase, as you say, folk, I think it's about the system of concentric rings of inheritance. So we have this kind of concept that yourself as an individual, then your family are the closest people to you, then your extended family, and then your friends, and then your tribe, and then your race, etc., etc. These concentric rings of proximity towards yourself, blood-wise. We could see a similar thing in paganism, where there are certain requirements to be closer to you in terms of the folk, as in an English Odinist is closer to me than an English Christian. So you'd have like English Odinist, and then maybe English Christian, and then non-English Odinist, and then
Mm.
European Christian, etc., etc. That ultimately is for each man to discern upon himself whether or not you value blood closeness more than you value the closeness of someone's faith to your own, is for each man to decide. Personally, I would say that faith and blood, then blood, and then faith. simply because it's taught in our religion that the lineage of a man and his blood is of paramount importance. And my sons or daughters or grandsons or granddaughters can convert and deconvert, and I'll have no choice over what they do in the long-term future.
Mm.
But once blood is lost, it's lost and there's no getting it back.
That's a very good perspective. Yeah, insofar as blood works and how it pertains to faith, Christianity as a doctrine is one to look to as a, well, somewhat opposite in this regard, because Christianity as an ideology teaches that all children before God are of God, and that there should be no borders across the earth between all of the various kingdoms of God. There is one unified body of God, and that is Christendom as a whole. In that regard, blood is excluded as a factor towards Christian sacredness. With the way that works, blood not being a factor as part of the religion means that all Christians are one and the same under this kingdom of God. That ideology in itself is counterpoint towards paganism, because in our faith, the blood of the folk as a whole is the most important thing. You know, the word blot itself, meaning sacrifice, has its roots etymologically in blood as well. So there's this interlinking between the blood and the sacred. On that point as a whole, I would agree that paganism is somewhat contradicted to Christianity for that. And for us, it would indeed go faith and blood, and then faith. For blood is the most sacred thing of all. Off of that point, one interesting thing, which is a bit more of a tangent, but it's still nonetheless an important thing to cover, is the role of men and women within society. At the moment, men and women within society have gender roles that are somewhat separated from our ancient past. Women tend to have a lot more of an egalitarian approach, and men somewhat more of a submissive approach. The gender roles are still somewhat similar to ancient times, insofar as men are still somewhat the superior sex, because we can't escape our base biology. But for the future pagan society, how do you feel gender roles are going to change or possibly even retain their shape? Do you feel like the ancient patriarchal structures will come back, or do you feel like that there'll be some form of like hybridization?
It's an interesting question. I think generally over time, the natural gender roles of men and women reassert themselves because fundamentally we are biologically designed to play certain roles. And this is not only a physical reality in terms of how men and women's physical biology differ, it's also a psychological reality in that men and women are happy doing certain things and less happy doing other things. If you look at younger generation women today, so women under the age of 30, they are severely unhappy with the roles that they now play in society. Feminist and egalitarian viewpoints and quote unquote girl boss culture is pushed by the cultural algorithms of the online space, but it's a very poor reflection of how most women actually feel. Um, there will be a lot of women that will ape and cry about feminism and how important it is to them, but when it comes to brass tacks, they tend to choose things that align with more traditional gender roles. Men very, very much as a very high percentage much prefer traditional gender roles. It's not even a question. And I think that's because in most men, there is still an inherent shame that exists with being seen as weak and adopting a more female gender role, such as being a stay at home father, not having a job and not earning money, being a more submissive role in the partnership, etc., etc. These things make men feel an inherent shame about being weak. And these kind of roles, having weak men and having more empowered women, they do not tend to survive on a civilizational clash basis because at the end of the day, women do not and cannot make good soldiers. They are not physically as capable of doing it as men are. And the more women you throw at the front line, the less breeders you have for the next generation. The battle of demographics will be won by more traditionalist societies. There is a level to which technology can maybe shift the balance a bit. And traditionally in Western societies, you do always see that women have more freedom and more rights and more say in the society than most other patriarchal civilizations. You know, the Famously, Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon women were allowed to own property and they were allowed to conduct business, but the traditional role of the house belonging to the woman and everything outside the house belonged to the man. But ultimately, it's a base necessity of civilization and a fundamental truth that in game theory, civilizations with more traditional gender roles will produce more children, and so they will, over time, be more successful.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've noticed quite a lot, especially down the pub, is that even the most like limp-wristed guys who aren't really that concerned with the idea of being masculine, the moment that they get a few drinks in them, suddenly it's all pruning and like basically strutting and stuff. You know, that kind of comes across. It's kind of like a base male instinct to want to act like that. So just to clarify that point, do you feel like gender roles will go back to a more primal state, or do you feel like the culture that we've shifted into can't be changed out of?
No, things will naturally realign by, I think, both necessity and evolution. Because first of all, there are many women nowadays who decided that they didn't want to have children. They wanted to have careers. They wanted to go into the corporate workplace. They wanted to girl boss, quote unquote. They wanted to be on equal terms with their partners, their husbands, etc., etc. One thing we notice with those women is that as soon as they hit the wall and they are no longer able to have children, they are stricken by regret. The number of women who went into the workplace, decided to be careerist, never have children, and then at the last minute, just slightly before they hit menopause or after they hit menopause, they are beset by regrets. It's a very common phenomenon to find people complaining about nowadays, both in the real world and online.
Mm.
That's backed up by another reality, which is that there will be some kind of genetic determinism to the kinds of women that gravitate towards going and having careers, and the kind of women that gravitate towards being more traditional and staying at home. These things tend to be a mix of nurture and nature, but there will be a natural component to that. So there will be a genetic component in that some women will be more predisposed to having more children. So just by the factor of natural selection, more naturally traditionalist women will have children and continue the next generation. So even with the social pressures that are put on women to be less traditional, they will favor choosing traditionalism anyway. So by natural selection, the only way that a system would ingrain the level of gender neutrality that we have, or even try to build on it further and even going as far as reversing gender roles, the only way that that would be done on a long-term scale is through severe top-down pressure. And I don't think civilizations, because it is an anti-natural mode of thinking, civilizations that adopt that mode of thinking historically always crumble in not too short an order. So I don't think it's something that is avoidable. The reassertion of gender roles always happens through society. We've seen it in the ancient world, first the Egyptians, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. These civilizations tend to adopt more gender neutral positions, and following that is collapse. I don't think it's necessarily that people say that giving women the vote is what causes the collapse of civilizations. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more a symptom that a society becomes softer, it becomes more effeminate, and so naturally women tend to have a larger voice.
And if you look at the way that the suffragette movement in Britain, at the very least, worked, a large part of how that social change came about was due to top-down pressure from the government taking power away from the man's household. A lot of that political change came from the central government, as opposed to being a natural, organic process that happened on a social level away from the government. In all reality, I feel like the government has somewhat of an interesting role in terms of our interconnection into paganism and our community as a whole. One of the large parts that I feel is quite important is the model for our economic society going forward. At the moment, the British government seems to be somewhat towards a quite neoliberal system that is still in place with some social democratic elements. But as I highlighted in my last episode, episode 4, Britannia Bleeds, the government is going a lot more authoritarian. Shifting on to the topic of economics, what's your thoughts in terms of the economic model for the future of our faith?
Well, for the future of our faith and for, any kind of commercial future for Western civilization in general, we've reached the natural conclusion of what I would call shareholder capitalism or large monopolistic capitalism. The problem we have with the current economic system is that the incentives of companies are largely to please shareholders. And the only way that you please shareholders is by getting them more money, by increasing the value of the company, increasing the revenue, increasing the profit, and upping their share prices. Now, the reason that all of the problems with the modern corporate environment have come about is because of that necessity, that drive to increase shareholder profits and to please shareholders. When a company has reached the point where it has no more natural customers, when a company has reached the point where it can't increase the prices of its products anymore, when a company has reached the point where it can't um, cut labor costs, where it can't cut production costs, you reach a natural end stage where there's no more blood that can be squeezed out of that cow. And shareholders have two options. Either one, be happy with the price of their shares and not drive for any more profit, which is stupid because that's not what a shareholder does. Or two, they draw their shares at they take their profit, right? So they've bought a share in the company when it was less valuable. Company's reached its maximum share price. It's been stagnant for a few years. They withdraw their shares and they put their investments into new upcoming companies. And naturally, a company having its shareholders withdraw, people aren't going to buy shares in those companies because everyone realizes it's reached its maximum potential, and then companies die. So the desperation of automation, cutting labor costs, squeezing overtime hours, not paying people extra money, the scrapping of bonuses, all of these things have come as natural stakeholder capitalism has reached its end game, when everything is monopolized, when all the companies are owned by umbrellas, by corporate conglomerates who can no longer keep making money and they have to stave off shareholder extraction. All they can do is try and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze shorter and shorter margins. So fundamentally, shareholder capitalism needs to end, needs to change. And the way that we do that is by going through with an economic model where you have far more companies. If you look in the past, up until about the 19th century, 85% of people in Britain were self-employed or their own business owners. In the future, we'll need to go towards a future where business owners are, much more decentralized. We don't have these large monopolistic corporations. Instead, we go back to a system where you buy bread from a local baker, you buy meat from a local butcher. We may have a mixture of maybe some large corporate entities, but they won't be anywhere near as powerful as some of the modern corporations are, like Google and Amazon. We will need to go to a situation where companies are generally family owned or private limited, so that the main driving force behind the corporation is people wanting to employ themselves in an industry where they provide products. Right now, the main driver behind so many businesses is purely making profit. You reach an end stage where you can no longer make profit. You can't win capitalism. So at some point, you have to stop playing the game. For a self-employed sole trader, for a small business partner, for a private limited company, the point at which you stop playing the game is the point at which you retire. Because even though you may not be earning more and more and more profit every single year, if you're a self-employed person, or if you're a small company, or if you're a private limited company, at the end of the day, it's what your career is. Somebody who's employed under a company, who works as an accountant, who works as a picker in a factory, who works as a mechanic, you don't quit your job just because you don't earn more and more money every year, because you need to have a stable source of income. So fundamentally, we need to change the economic model where we stop being an economy of investors and shareholders and stakeholders trying to get more and more profit every year, but rather we become an economy of professionals providing services. And there will still be investors. There's always investors, but investment is going to be done on a smaller and more individualistic scale.
I've always felt that pagan ethics is a big part that comes into the way that we operate business, or at least how we should operate business going into the future. Even labour conditions, as an example, were a lot more fair on workers in the past than most people give them credit for. Under feudalism, or even before that, far from being a time where you had to toil 12 hours a day every single day, there was much better working conditions compared to these days where you're glued to a screen for up to 12 hours, 5 to 6 days a week. The 2-day weekend as a point of interest actually came about because of organic social change from the workers from the ground up, as opposed to being a centralized top-down pressure that was added onto them. So when considering the way that obviously labour works, it seems that trying to implement pagan ethics into our future business models is something that would not only allow us to drive profit in the way that we need to do to run a society, but also allow us to treat our folk as a whole with much more fairness. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's a weird kind of model we have because the average person today, in a material sense, is far better off than all of our ancestors. It's the psychological landscape that really is what is damaging people. It's the psychological stress of virtual interactions constantly, of a monotonous, meaningless job where you feel like you don't really produce anything, you don't have any positive impact, you're just turning a cog in a big corporate machine, which is how many people in office jobs feel. This type of environment is only possible, as you've said, in a situation where the manager and then the directors don't really care much for the well-being and for the health of their employees. So if the people at the top had senses of ethics, actually cared about the people that work below them, that would be a huge driving factor in ensuring that the average worker had quality of life. And pagan ethics are one way, and the way that we should pursue, of ensuring people have that moral shield that stops them from implementing soulless corporate practices. And of course, in a situation where the culture was derived from pagan ethics, it would be, we would make it illegal to institute practices that took advantage of workers in such a way.
Do you believe usury should be included as something to be possibly outlawed in a future pagan society, or rather a future pagan economic model?
Usury is something that should be very, very heavily controlled. There's no escaping, in a modern economic sense, that the charging of interest in some form or another, it's kind of fundamental to encouraging people to make smart economic choices. For instance, saving. If you're going to get people to save money away, it's important to get people to save money away because they have, futures, they have pensions they need to take care of, there might be windfalls in the future. In order to people to get to save money, you have to encourage some form of interest, right? There has to be some incentive for people to put money somewhere, because otherwise they never would, because your economic incentive would be to spend money as soon as you got it, because you don't want it to depreciate in value. The depreciation of cash value is kind of inherent to any economic system. Even if you don't have usury, even if you're gold backed, if you have any kind of fiat currency, which you need to inevitably have, because otherwise your economy is limited by the supply of gold you have, or the supply of silver you have, or whatever backup method you use. And that's physically limited by how much you can dig out of the earth. So you can't grow an economy and have it prosper without some form of fiat currency, which inherently means some kind of devaluation in the future. You have to have interest as a model to protect against that. But what you do need to do is you need to very, very heavily legally limit amounts of interest being charged, the time frame in which interest can be charged. And of course, you need to criminalize very predatory actions, things like short charging, long and short playing, derivative folding, and these kind of really advanced financial practices which are extremely predatory. You need to, obviously criminalize these kind of practices.
Because even coming from a tech background as I do, there's a big push towards a decentralized blockchain currency as the model for replacement. Even in that element, though, it would still need to have some form of interest as a way for the currency to appreciate, as you say, because if not, it would essentially just evolve into a barter economy, which I'm sure a lot of pagans would love, but isn't necessarily a great way to accumulate a lot of wealth for a nation to exercise world power. And even if in the best case scenario, Northwestern European societies did convert back to their ancient roots, we still have 8 billion people to contend with on the earth. So yeah, I think in any form of currency, some form of interest is most likely required. But I would argue that regulation is probably a good model for it, or at the very least, regulation on a local or top-down level, whichever one takes place.
Yeah, it's a very complex question because when we talk about usury and generally speaking, the charging of interest and making money off of money, it's morally, we all agree that it's not a good way to live, right? Because everybody should have a job that produces some kind of value. The problem is inherently that even in the medieval world, where kings and queens had serfdoms and they were presiding over economies which were heavily involved bartering on an individual local level, farmers would often trade each other in milk and cheese and bread and meat. Even in medieval England, you found that the courts and the kings and queens of Europe were importing populations, like Jews, like Sephardic Jews, for instance, that we imported from Spain at one point to deal with money lending because it was criminalized under Christian law codes. The problem is that kings and queens found that running an advanced economy as it was at the time just becomes impossible without some form of interest, because again you're limited by how much gold you can dig out the ground or how much silver you can dig out the ground. And when your population increases and the total productivity of your population increases, but the amount of wealth that you have to back up a gold backed or silver backed system or whatever backing you use, if it's digital currency like Bitcoin, the population increases, but the total amount of value that you have for a standard trading medium doesn't increase. So either the value of that trading medium has to increase, and then if the value of it increases, you have to have some kind of methodology of measuring the value. And this is where fiat currencies come about in the first place, because you need to have something like a pound or a dollar to measure how much the value of gold has gone up, even in a gold-backed system. You have to have some kind of backing. So interest becomes inevitable. It's a natural outgrowth of any kind of advanced economic system. And so then your fundamental argument becomes, do you go back to like a Neolithic style of living? And I would argue that it's just simply not feasible. Regardless of
Mm,
whether you want to do that or not, you can't. So
mm,
you have to accept the necessity of some of these economic mechanisms, but you heavily limit them, and you make the penalties for working outside of these heavily limited mechanisms extremely high. And
mm,
culturally, you have to enforce the idea that these things are necessities, not virtues.
mm. One of the things that was covered by Dr. Kaczynski in his book, which I won't mention the name of, is really he proposes a solution for the answer to how to go back to a prior state of technology, that being a more primal state. But the solution he gives is really also its foible. His belief was that the only way that you could truly achieve a pre-industrial social order across the globe was to have essentially a series of global revolutions that were all coordinated at once. Because the one issue with going back on any kind of technological level is that if a country near you doesn't do the same, then they will end up just basically dominating your society. With the way that model works, it really comes down to a case of, even if it were possible for that to be the case, if pagans really sat down and thought about that question, they would realize that they don't actually want to go back to a more primal state of being. What they want to do is to live in an environment that's clean, in an environment where they can raise their children safely, and more importantly, to both of those things, I would argue, an environment where they're free to pursue their own destinies as opposed to having them laid out for them by the state. So, on to the next question, which may be somewhat of a lowball question in and of itself. Do you believe that money is inherently something that is sacred, or do you believe it's just a commodity that we should be pursuing? I would ask whether it was something that is acceptable in our faith, but it's quite clear that it is acceptable. Our forefathers used currency. There's no way to escape currency as a concept. So for the question itself, do you feel like that money is just an inherent value system, or do you believe that it's actually sacred?
So this is a good question, and I would like to start by just bearing the idea that money, is immoral in any way in accordance with our faith by quoting the Havamal. So this is stanza 39. I found none so noble or free with his food, who was not gladdened with a gift, nor one who gave his gifts such store, but he loved reward, could he win it. Following on from that, stanza 40. Let no man stint him and suffer need of the wealth he has won in life. Oft is saved for a foe what was meant for a friend, and much goes worse than one weeds.
Hmm.
What the meanings of these two stanzas in the Have 'Em All give us is that money and wealth, in whichever form it comes in a material sense, are a joy to people, and they are a protection against the worst things that may happen in life. The reality of money is that it is the prime mover of the world in which we live in. The old phrase, money makes the world go round, is true. And it's true in that what money does is it gives you freedom. It gives you the ability to access resources and then use those resources in whichever way you see fit. In a way, it gives you the ability to choose your problems. When you are impoverished, you're living in poor conditions, in poor sanitation, you're struggling to pay rent, you're struggling to buy yourself enough food for the week. And of course, things like a gym membership, access to educational materials like books, access to, online subscriptions for educational services, access to courses, university courses or college courses, access to transport, cars, access to technology and access to being able to pay fees for things like starting new businesses or paying professionals to work and help you with things. All of these things are cut off, and the problems that you have are chosen for you. When you have wealth, you have means. When you have means, you have the ability to choose your problems. And what that really means is choosing what directions you want to go in life. Money is your freedom, and inherently, freedom is a large virtue in our faith. It's why the Have 'Em All gives us these stanzas telling us that it is wise to cherish the value that you have. So I would say that the idea that money is the root of all evil and things. Look, money is a neutral force in the world. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. It depends who's holding it. I would say to pagans that you need to look at money as a mechanism by which you can enact your will in the world. And when you realize that, you realize why the people in the world who are deciding what happens are the rich and the powerful, wealthy elites. They're not the military elites. They're not the people who run militaries. They're not even really the people who we vote for in democratic societies. It's the people who have wealth. And there is a big reason for that. And because the goals and because the agendas that they have do not line up with our agendas, it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad for their agendas. They come from different folk, they have different agendas. It may very well be in their interest. There's nothing stopping us from enacting our interest, except that they have the money and we don't.
So on the question of money as a whole, as to whether it's sacred or whether it just has some form of inherent value that isn't sacred, to be honest, I feel both are somewhat irrelevant in terms of the practicality on pagans on the ground level. I'll clarify my position firstly, just before I explain why I feel like it's somewhat still irrelevant. So the way I feel about it is that money isn't inherently a virtue in and of itself. The virtue comes down to how you use that money as a practical tool. Like with anything, whether it be technology, politics, anything that you try to escape from by not engaging in will inevitably catch up with you. It doesn't matter if you don't use technology, the world around you is still moving forward with technology and it can't be stopped. It doesn't matter whether or not you engage in politics or not, politics will still have a tangible effect on you and your local community. And likewise, it doesn't matter if you don't have money. Better a home though a hut it may be, a man is master at home. It doesn't matter how much of a master you are in your own home, the masters within society still exist and they have far more money than you. And likewise, that verse in and of itself, that Have 'Em All verse that I've just quoted, is in reference to humility in how you're living your lives. The people who own society do not have humility and they will come and smash your fucking roof in. So in terms of the way money works, in terms of whether or not I believe it to be a sacred commodity or not, is really an irrelevancy, because money is the means by which you can fend off people who would seek to take away your freedoms and liberties. To end the podcast, I'll give you just an interesting question that I want to ask a few of my guests as they come on the show, which is, which god do you feel is the most practical for the 21st century pagan? Now, there's no wrong or right answer on this. It's purely your opinion on which god you feel is most practical on the ground level for modern pagans.
Well, I personally would contest that for any pagan of any era, there's not necessarily one correct god that's best for all people. I would
Correct.
say that to each man and woman, their soul may belong more to one or to a set of gods than another. We have historic cults of entire countries. For instance, in Norway, it seems to be evident that Odin was worshipped most primarily. In Denmark, it seems that Thor was worshipped most primarily, and in Sweden, it seems that it was Ingwi. And in England, we have evidence that perhaps it was Woden who was worshipped the most, but Thor and Chu and Saxnot and Ingwi were obviously very heavily venerated as well. Each man must look to themselves and must meditate and find out which gods or which goddesses communicate to them the best. What is your profession? Historically speaking, gods were venerated specifically in their spiritual elements. You know, those who were warriors would often worship Odin, but also we have, attested evidence that ancient Germanic warriors would worship Tyr or Chu. The Romans called him Mars, that they would erect statues and idols in Tyr's honor. We know that certain gods would be prayed to. Thor was a very popular god for farmers because they would pray to him for good rains and good harvest. Same with the Lord Frey, who would be worshipped too because, of course, he was an abundance and fertility god. We know that in times of harvest, the dawn goddess Easter, or Freya, as many believe her to be cognate with, was worshipped. And we know that at Yule, in the darkness of the winter, Odin was most sacredly worshipped for his association with the wild hunt, the turning of the seasons, and the death of the old year and the bringing of the new one. There are many different gods. If you are a blacksmith, you might venerate Wayland as a kind of god or an ancestral spirit of production and of blacksmithing. If you're a trader, if you're a merchant, you might look towards Wade. If you're a seaman, you might look towards Njord. Somebody, a martial artist, maybe you work towards, I think, Modi was worshipped in Iceland as a god to pray for good luck in wrestling. And
Modi
of course,
was worshipped, yes.
yeah. And of course, as we go on and as we communicate more with the gods, we have to realize that we're re-establishing this relationship we have with humans, with our divine pantheon. And as we go forward, we will begin to understand our gods more, and we will begin to uncover aspects of them which our ancestors didn't know. We would probably look today at Woden as being the god of computer science and physics, because of course he's the god of knowledge. We would probably look towards Bragi perhaps as being the god of heavy metal and rock and roll. These gods have universal and timeless relevance, but we must look to seek them in their relationships to our everyday lives as it is relevant to us as our ancient ancestors did, and the relevance to their lives.
I feel that likewise to yourself, it does depend on the role that you're in. So, for example, my personal patron, Woden, part of why I follow him for many, many reasons, which I won't go into necessarily, but part of that element is because he is a Gothi. He is the Gothi of the gods, god of priests and priest of gods. I feel that the role you go into does make a massive difference in terms of the gods you're venerating. And while we, as modern Germanic Gothar, practice as best we can to service all of the gods as a whole, that's somewhat ahistorical to how ancient Gothar would have practiced. The god cults themselves, while they are incredible and they do need to make a comeback as society goes forward, the model we're currently using is really a placeholder in lieu of those god cults that need to naturally evolve and develop around communities. While I do promote orthodoxy as a whole for our religion, I feel that that allowance of tradition to evolve and change organically around these god cults is far more important than one man or one community servicing all of the gods. That leads me on to my last question of the evening, which is, what's your view on the resurgence of a Germanic priesthood? Do you feel that it's necessary? And if you feel it is necessary, do you believe that there's any changes that we need to make in terms of how the modern priesthood would operate compared to the past?
I think it's inevitable, and I think its inevitability derives from its necessity. The ancients had priests, they had priestly cults and castes, whether it was the Germanics, the Celts, the Greco Romans, priests were a reality. And that comes from a deeper human reality, which is that certain individuals are more in touch and in tune with the divine than others. Certain individuals have calling towards the divine. Um, and also, certain individuals will need to be full-time communicators with the gods in some capacity, because our society is structured, it's stratified. We have people that are engineers, people that are merchants, people that are scientists, people that are farmers, people that are businessmen, people that are athletes, etc., etc., etc. If you are a fully employed person with a family, you do not have the necessary time in your day to devote towards scholarly practice, towards ritual devotion that is necessary for the maintaining of temples, the cultural preservation of traditions and of religious practices. These things take time, they take resources, they take expertise, learning, things that not every single man can be devoted to specifically in his practice or in any woman's practice in that case. Without a centralized priesthood, you are going to find that there becomes no real preservation of religious tradition and no real development of religious tradition. And that just leads towards stagnation. And ultimately, you are going to be outcompeted by another religious group that has such a caste. You'll be outcompeted by Christians or Muslims or whoever.
Mm. One issue that I have as well with how a lot of people of an anti-priesthood stance is that it opens the door to incredible amounts of abuse of power, of people, of money, of property. Priests as a whole need to be able to not just regulate the pagan community at large, but also to regulate one another. And I feel like that's a much more important role that they play, as opposed to this notion that we can have a paganism reborn where there's no priestly caste. There's a reason why the way our faith practices the man being in his own home and practicing his faith as the king priest in his own home, but then in external society, the king is king and the priest is priest. This separation of the external society from the clan home is an important distinction to make, and I don't feel like one can exist without the other. I'm a big proponent of clanship. I'm a big advocate of going back to a more familial kinship tradition as opposed to the centralized top-down federal or parliamentary systems that exist in the Western world. But I feel like there does need to still be a gradient of interconnection between the clan and the society as a whole. Finishing on that point, do you have any last words before we end the podcast?
Yeah, so I have a closing thought that I'd like to give to people, which is that I have heavily advocated in the space, and I know I'm not an online personality. Nobody who listens to this podcast probably is going to know who I am, but I have been in the sphere for a long time, and what I've been promoting in the sphere is literacy. So please educate yourself in any topic in which you feel passionate about, but in more specific terms, literacy in cultural, scientific, and economic manners, because these things are very, very crucial to the material life that you can generate for yourself. Do educate yourself in the tax code, for instance, in the running and the implementation of a private business. Educate yourself in some basic economic practices. Learn how to take advantage of, if you're a sole trader, if you have a small business, and I very much encourage people to go into business for themselves if possible, because it gives you a whole load of advantages that you can use to yourself to minimize the taxes that you pay, to minimize the amount of um, personal expenses that you need to take on for yourself. You can leverage the tax system in an advantageous way. You can take advantage of certain government mechanisms. There are certain avenues, levies, etc., which are available to small businesses that aren't available to individuals. You can build up relationships with people. It's very much important as you become more of a man in the world to know somebody that's a good accountant, know somebody that's a good mechanic, know somebody that's a good electrician, know somebody that's a farmer, know someone that's a plumber. Make these relationships with people because they will save you a huge amount of time and money. And they kind of the same thing. Ultimately, time is money. Just become an educated, well-developed, well-rounded person and be a good example to the community, because we oftentimes in the pagan sphere unfortunately embarrass ourselves with the level of ignorance that some people in this community have. And we are not going to develop as a faith, we are not going to mature and become more of a cultural force than we are if we wallow in ignorance because we decide that any outside source of knowledge or any aspiration towards academia outside of our spheres is somehow controlled or is somehow evil or anti-religious or something like that. Do not criticize something before you know about it.
Knowledge is paramount, so saith All Father. A man of real-world action and digital inaction, Oathsmith, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Thank you for listening to the Fire and Hammer podcast. If you'd like to keep up to date with any of the Order's activities or the activities of any guests featured on our show, please see our shared social media links. The Order greatly appreciates your support, for it is the heart of the fire that keeps us alive. Hail the gods.